The knock came so softly that Yancey almost mistook it for the wind rattling the shutters of his isolated cabin. But when it sounded again, more insistent this time, he set down the tin cup of lukewarm coffee and reached for the rifle propped against the stone fireplace. 5 months he had been alone in these Montana mountains, watching the snow pile higher and higher against the walls of his cabin. And in all that time, not a single soul had ventured up the treacherous path that led to his door. He moved cautiously toward the entrance, his boots creaking on the rough-hewn floorboards, one hand on the rifle and the other reaching for the heavy wooden bolt. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the bitter cold of February 1878, and Wade hesitated for just a moment before pulling the door open. What he saw made him lower the rifle immediately. A woman stood on his threshold, her face pale as the snow that clung to her dark hair, her lips tinged with blue. She wore a coat that might have been adequate for autumn, but was woefully insufficient for the brutal Montana winter, and her eyes, deep brown and desperate, met his with a mixture of fear and hope that struck something in his chest he thought had frozen solid months ago. "Please," she whispered, and then her knees buckled. Wade caught her before she hit the ground, the rifle clattering to the floor as he swept her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel her shivering violently against his chest as he kicked the door shut with his heel and carried her to the chair nearest the fire. Her skin felt like ice beneath his calloused fingers as he quickly began removing her inadequate coat, then reached for the thick wool blankets he kept folded near the hearth. "Can you hear me?" he asked, wrapping the blankets around her trembling form. "Miss, can you tell me your name?" Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on him with difficulty. "Beatrice," she managed through chattering teeth. "Beatrice Reeves. How long have you been out there?" Wade was already moving to the fire, stoking it higher, adding more wood until the flames roared. He grabbed another blanket from his bed in the corner and brought it to her, tucking it around her shoulders. "Since yesterday morning," she said, and her voice cracked. "My horse threw a shoe about 5 miles down the mountain. I tried to lead her, but the snow got too deep and she panicked. Broke free from me and ran. I saw your smoke and just kept walking." Wade felt his jaw tighten. 24 hours in this weather on foot without proper clothing. She should be dead. "I need to check your fingers and toes. Frostbite." She nodded weakly, and he knelt before her, carefully removing her soaked boots. Her stockings were frozen stiff, and he had to work gently to peel them away. Her feet were deathly pale, but when he pressed carefully on her toes, watching for the telltale white patches that would indicate serious damage, he saw with relief that the skin still had some circulation. Her fingers were in better shape, though 2 on her left hand were worryingly white at the tips. "You might lose these too," he said honestly, meeting her eyes. "But the rest should be fine if we warm you slowly." "Thank you," she whispered, "for letting me in, for not turning me away." Wade stood and moved to his small stove, where he began heating water. "What kind of man would I be if I left a woman to freeze on my doorstep?" "A cautious one," Beatrice said, and despite everything, there was a hint of something that might have been humor in her voice. "You don't know me. I could be dangerous." He glanced back at her, taking in her slight frame, her exhausted face, the way her hands trembled as she clutched the blankets. "I will take my chances." Over the next hours, Wade worked methodically to bring Beatrice back from the edge. He made her drink warm broth slowly, knowing that anything too hot could shock her system. He wrapped her frostbitten fingers in clean cloth and kept adding wood to the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm. She drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes murmuring words he could not quite catch, and he found himself watching her more than he should, noticing the elegant curve of her jaw, the way her lashes cast shadows on her cheeks. When she finally woke fully, the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered window with shades of orange and pink. Wade was at the table, mending a tear in one of his shirts by the light of an oil lamp, and he looked up when he heard her stir. "How do you feel?" he asked. Beatrice sat up slowly, testing her limbs. "Like I walked through hell and found heaven on the other side." She looked around the cabin properly for the first time, taking in the sparse but tidy space. "This is your home for the winter," Wade confirmed. "I am a trapper. I come up here every November and stay until the pass opens again in April or May. The isolation suits me." "5 months alone," Beatrice said softly. "That must be difficult." Wade shrugged, setting aside his mending. "It is better than the alternative." He saw the question in her eyes but did not elaborate. "What were you doing out here, Miss Reeves? These mountains are no place for a lone traveler in winter." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "I was running," she finally admitted. "From Utica. From a man my father wanted me to marry." Wade felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the winter outside. "Your father arranged a marriage to a rancher named Malcolm Greer. He is 50 years old and already buried 2 wives. My father owes him money, you see, and this was how he chose to settle the debt." Beatrice's voice was steady, but Wade could hear the anger beneath it. "I am 22 years old and I refuse to be sold like livestock. So you ran." "I had a plan," she said defensively. "My mother's sister lives in Helena. I thought if I could get there, she would take me in. I bought a horse with the little money I had saved and I set out 2 weeks ago. But the weather kept getting worse, and I took a wrong turn somewhere, and then—" She gestured helplessly at the cabin around them. Wade stood and moved to the small window, looking out at the endless white landscape. "Helena is 100 miles northeast of here. You were heading the wrong direction entirely." "I know that now," Beatrice said quietly. "I had a map, but I lost it when the horse bolted." She paused. "Am I your prisoner here?" He turned to look at her, surprised. "Why would you be my prisoner?" "The snow," she said. "You said the pass does not open until April or May. That means I am trapped here, with you, a stranger." Wade crossed back to his chair and sat down heavily. "I suppose that is true, but you are not my prisoner, Miss Reeves. You are my guest, an unexpected one, but a guest nonetheless." He met her eyes steadily. "I will not harm you, you have my word." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because Beatrice nodded slowly. "Then I suppose we are stuck with each other for the next few months." "I suppose we are," Wade agreed, and despite the strangeness of the situation, he found himself almost smiling. The first week was awkward. Wade was not used to sharing his space, and Beatrice was still recovering her strength. They moved around each other carefully, speaking in polite half-sentences, each hyper-aware of the other's presence in the small cabin. Wade gave her his bed and made himself a pallet near the fire. He taught her how to maintain the stove and showed her where he kept his stores of food: dried beans, salt pork, flour, and the precious coffee he rationed carefully. Beatrice, for her part, insisted on making herself useful. Her fingers healed better than Wade had hoped, though the tips remained sensitive and pale. She took over the cooking, transforming his simple fare into meals that actually had flavor. She mended his clothes with a skill that spoke of years of practice. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Wade learned that Beatrice had grown up in Utica, the only daughter of a shopkeeper who had gambled away his prosperity. She had been educated at a small school run by a widow from Boston, and she loved to read, though her father had sold most of her books to pay his debts. She spoke of her mother with a sadness that made Wade's chest ache, a woman who had died when Beatrice was 16. leaving her alone with a father who saw her only as a commodity. Beatrice learned that Wade had come to Montana 5 years ago from Missouri, leaving behind a life he would not speak of in detail. He had fought in the war, though he did not say for which side, and there was a darkness in his eyes when he mentioned it that kept her from pressing. He had been married once briefly, to a woman named Sarah who had died of fever their first winter together. Since then, he had been alone, moving from town to town, never settling, never allowing himself to care too deeply about anything or anyone. "That sounds lonely," Beatrice said one evening as they sat by the fire. She was working on a piece of embroidery, something she had started with scraps of fabric and thread from Wade's supplies, while he carved a new handle for his skinning knife. "It is safer," Wade replied. "Safer than what?" "Than loving someone and losing them again." Beatrice was quiet for a moment, her needle pausing in its work. "My mother used to say that a life without love is not really a life at all. It is just existing. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Beatrice said softly. "And I think she would be disappointed in me if I let fear keep me from truly living." Wade looked up at her then, really looked at her in the warm glow of the firelight. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and her brown eyes were serious and thoughtful. She was beautiful, he realized with a start. Not just pretty, but truly beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with the arrangement of her features and everything to do with the strength and kindness he saw in her. "You are very brave," he heard himself say, "to leave everything you knew. To strike out on your own." Beatrice shook her head. "I am not brave, I am terrified. Every day I wonder if I made the right choice, if I should have just married Malcolm Greer and made the best of it." "No," Wade said fiercely, surprising them both with his vehemence. "No, you should not have. You deserve better than to be traded for a debt. You deserve to choose your own life." She met his eyes, and something passed between them, something electric and frightening and wonderful. "Thank you," she whispered. The days began to blend together in a way that was not unpleasant. February gave way to March, and though the snow showed no signs of melting, the sun grew stronger, staying in the sky a little longer each day. Wade taught Beatrice how to set snares for rabbits, and she proved to be a quick learner, her fingers nimble despite their healing. Together, they ventured out on snowshoes that Wade fashioned for her, checking his trap lines and bringing back furs that he would sell once they could reach civilization again. Beatrice found Wade's small collection of books, 3 battered volumes that had somehow survived his years of wandering, and she read them aloud by the fire in the evenings. Her voice was clear and expressive, bringing life to the words on the page, and Wade found himself looking forward to those hours with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened him. They talked about everything and nothing. Beatrice told him about her childhood, about sneaking out to watch the stars with her mother, about the kitten she had loved and lost. Wade found himself sharing memories he had thought buried forever. His brother who had died at Shiloh, the farm where he had grown up, the dreams he had once had of a peaceful life with land of his own. "Why did you give up on that dream?" Beatrice asked one night. Wade was quiet for a long time. "Because dreams require hope," he finally said, "and I lost mine somewhere along the way." "Maybe you could find it again," she suggested gently. He looked at her, at the hope and warmth in her eyes, and felt something crack open inside his chest. "Maybe," he said, and meant it. The turning point came in late March, during a storm that was fiercer than any they had weathered before. The wind screamed around the cabin like a living thing, and snow piled so high against the door that Wade had to dig them out twice a day to keep from being buried entirely. On the second night of the storm, something crashed against the side of the cabin with such force that the whole structure shuddered. Beatrice cried out in alarm, and without thinking, Wade moved to her side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. She turned into him instinctively, pressing her face against his chest, and he could feel her heart racing against his ribs. "It is all right," he murmured into her hair. "The cabin is solid. It has weathered worse than this." "I was so scared," she whispered, and when she looked up at him, her face was inches from his. Wade knew he should step back. Knew that this was dangerous territory, that he had promised himself he would not let this happen. But Beatrice's eyes were dark and deep and full of something that made his breath catch, and when she lifted her hand to touch his bearded jaw, he was lost. He kissed her softly at first, giving her every chance to pull away. But instead, she made a small sound in the back of her throat and pressed closer, her fingers tangling in his hair. The kiss deepened, becoming something hungry and desperate and full of all the loneliness and longing they had both been carrying. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "Beatrice," he said hoarsely, "I should not have done that." "Why not?" Her voice was steady despite her rapid breathing. "Did you not want to?" "God, yes, I wanted to," he admitted. "I have wanted to for weeks now. But you are here because you had no choice, because the weather trapped you. I do not want you to feel obligated to anything just because I gave you shelter." Beatrice pulled back enough to look him in the eye, and there was steel in her gaze. "Wade Yancey, I am not some helpless thing to be pitied. I kissed you back because I wanted to. Because I have been falling in love with you since the day you wrapped me in blankets and saved my life, and I am tired of pretending otherwise." Wade felt his heart stop and then start again, racing. "You love me?" "Yes," she said simply. "I know it is fast and I know the circumstances are strange, but yes, I love you." He kissed her again, harder this time, pouring everything he felt into it. When they broke apart, he was smiling, really smiling for the first time in years. "I love you too," he said, the words feeling both foreign and right on his tongue. "I did not think I could feel this way again, but you came into my life like a miracle, and I love you, Beatrice Reeves." She laughed, the sound bright and joyful, and kissed him again. "So what do we do now?" "Now," Wade said, brushing a strand of hair back from her face with infinite gentleness, "we figure out our future together." They talked through the night, making plans as the storm raged outside. Wade told her about a piece of land he had been eyeing near Billings, good grazing land with a stream running through it. He had saved money from his trapping, enough to make a down payment if he was careful. Beatrice told him about her skills with numbers and bookkeeping, how she had helped her father with the shop before he had lost it. Together they dreamed of a ranch, small at first but with room to grow. A real home. "We could be married," Wade said as the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows. "Once we get to a town with a minister, if that is what you want." "It is what I want," Beatrice assured him, lacing her fingers through his. "More than anything." The storm finally broke on the third day, and they emerged into a world transformed. The sun was brilliant on the fresh snow, and the air was so clear it hurt to breathe. Wade and Beatrice stood on the cabin's small porch, his arm around her waist, and looked out at the mountains stretching endlessly in every direction. "It is beautiful," Beatrice said softly. "It is," Wade agreed, but he was looking at her. April came slowly, the snow retreating inch by stubborn inch. Wade grew restless, eager to be off the mountain and start their new life together, but he forced himself to be patient. The pass was still too dangerous to attempt, and he would not risk Beatrice's safety for the sake of his impatience. They used the time to prepare. Wade sorted through his furs, selecting the best pelts to sell. Beatrice made a list of everything they would need to purchase in Billings: supplies, tools, livestock. They talked endlessly about the ranch, refining their plans, debating details. Should they focus on cattle or horses? Both, they decided. How many acres did they need? As many as they could afford, with room to expand, and in the quiet moments they learned each other. Wade discovered that Beatrice sang when she worked, soft melodies that filled the cabin with warmth. Beatrice learned that Wade had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was comfortable, making her laugh with unexpected observations. They kissed often, unable to keep their hands off each other now that they had acknowledged their feelings, and Wade marveled at how natural it felt, how right. By mid-April, the pass was finally clear enough to attempt. Wade loaded his furs and supplies onto the packhorse he had kept fed through the winter, and they set out early one morning, Beatrice riding behind him on his saddle horse. The journey down the mountain took 2 days, and they camped one night under the stars, wrapped together in blankets by their fire. "Are you scared?" Wade asked, running his fingers through her hair. "No," Beatrice said, and she sounded surprised. "I thought I would be, going back to civilization, facing the possibility that someone might recognize me, but I am not. I have you now." "Always," Wade promised. "You will always have me." They reached Utica 3 days later, approaching cautiously. Wade wanted to avoid the town center, but they needed supplies, and Beatrice insisted she wanted to know if there had been any word about her disappearance. They need not have worried. The storekeeper, a garrulous man named Peters, was happy to fill them in on all the town gossip as Wade made his purchases. Malcolm Greer had been furious when Beatrice vanished, had ranted and raved for weeks, but eventually he had found another young woman to marry, the daughter of a farmer who was even more desperate than Beatrice's father had been. The wedding had taken place in February. "And what about Samuel Reeves?" Beatrice asked carefully, using her father's name. "The shopkeeper," Peters shook his head sadly. "Left town in January, skipped out on his remaining debts and headed east last anyone heard. Good riddance, I say. The man was a coward and a fool." Beatrice was quiet as they left the store, and Wade squeezed her hand. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said after a moment. "I am sad that it ended this way, but I am not surprised, and I am relieved. He cannot come looking for me, cannot try to drag me back. I am truly free." "We both are," Wade said, and kissed her in the middle of the street, not caring who saw. They were married a week later in Billings by a circuit preacher, with the land agent and his wife as witnesses. Beatrice wore a simple blue dress they had bought with some of Wade's fur money, and Wade cleaned up better than she had ever seen him, his beard trimmed and his dark hair combed back. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Wade kissed her with such tenderness that the land agent's wife dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The land Wade had been eyeing was still available, and they purchased 80 acres with a creek running through it and mountains rising in the distance. There was an old cabin on the property, barely more than a shack, but it had good bones, and Wade promised to expand it. "We will build something real here," he told Beatrice on their first night on their own land as they lay together in the tiny cabin. "A home, a life. We already have," Beatrice said, resting her head on his chest. "Everything else is just details." The first year was hard in ways that neither of them had fully anticipated. They worked from dawn to dusk and beyond, clearing land, mending fences, buying their first small herd of cattle. Wade proved to be a skilled builder, and slowly, room by room, he expanded the cabin into a proper house. Beatrice threw herself into creating a home, planting a garden, making curtains, filling the space with warmth and life. Money was tight, and there were setbacks. They lost 2 calves to a late spring freeze. The creek flooded in June, washing out part of their fence. Wade injured his hand while clearing brush and could not work for a week. But through it all, they had each other, and that made everything bearable. Their neighbors, a Swedish couple named the Andersons who had been ranching in the area for a decade, proved to be invaluable allies. They shared advice and tools, helped with the heavy work, and adopted Wade and Beatrice into the small community of ranchers in the valley. Beatrice became friends with Elsa Anderson, a practical woman with 3 young children who taught her the finer points of preserving food and dealing with the harsh Montana climate. By the time their first winter together rolled around, Wade and Beatrice were ready. They had a solid house, well-stocked stores, and a small but healthy herd. They also had something else. Beatrice was pregnant. She told Wade on a snowy evening in December as they sat by the fire in their new sitting room. She had been waiting for the right moment, nervous despite knowing how he would react. "Wade," she said, setting down her mending, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the account book where he had been tallying their expenses. "What is it?" "I am going to have a baby," she said simply. "In the summer. July, I think." Wade stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and Beatrice felt a flicker of fear. But then his face transformed, breaking into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he crossed to her in 3 long strides, pulling her into his arms. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Beatrice asked, though his reaction left little doubt. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Wade said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You have given me everything, Beatrice. A home, a purpose, a reason to hope, and now this. I love you so much." "I love you too," she said, and felt tears of joy sliding down her cheeks. Their son was born on a hot July afternoon in 1879, with Elsa Anderson attending as midwife. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Wade, pacing outside the bedroom door, thought he might lose his mind with fear. But finally, he heard the thin wail of a newborn, and Elsa emerged beaming. "You have a son," she announced, "and your wife is asking for you." Wade practically ran into the room. Beatrice was propped up against the pillows, exhausted and pale but smiling, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his son's red, wrinkled face. "He is perfect," Wade whispered. "He is," Beatrice agreed. "Would you like to hold him?" Wade took the baby carefully, cradling him against his chest. The infant's eyes were closed, but one tiny fist waved in the air, and Wade felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "Hello, William," he said softly, using the name they had chosen. "Welcome to the world." The years that followed were full and rich in ways that Wade had never imagined possible. William grew from a tiny infant into a sturdy toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's thoughtful eyes. The ranch prospered, slowly but steadily, and Wade and Beatrice expanded their herd and their land. They built a proper barn and a bunkhouse for the seasonal hands they hired during Roundup. In 1881, Beatrice gave birth to twin daughters, Catherine and Lily, who filled the house with noise and laughter. Wade proved to be a devoted father, patient and loving, and Beatrice often found herself watching him play with their children, marveling at the transformation in the man who had once thought himself too damaged for family life. They had their struggles, of course. There was the year of the drought, when they had to sell half their herd just to survive. There was the winter when all 3 children came down with influenza, and Wade and Beatrice took turns staying up through the night, watching over them with terror in their hearts. There were disagreements and hard times, moments when the weight of responsibility seemed crushing. But through it all, they had each other. And that, they both knew, was worth more than all the gold in Montana. One evening in the spring of 1887, Wade and Beatrice sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the mountains. The children were asleep inside, William now a gangly 8-year-old and the twins rambunctious 6-year-olds. The ranch stretched out before them, green and thriving, with cattle dotting the hills and horses grazing in the pasture. "Do you ever think about that winter?" Beatrice asked, leaning against Wade's shoulder. "In the cabin on the mountain, all the time," Wade admitted. "I think about how close I came to never knowing you. If you had chosen a different path, if that storm had not driven you to my door, my whole life would be different." "Mine too," Beatrice said. "I was so scared that day, but also desperate. And when you opened that door, when you let me in without hesitation, I felt hope for the first time in months." Wade turned to look at her, this woman who had transformed his entire world. There were fine lines around her eyes now, and silver threads beginning in her dark hair, but to him, she was as beautiful as the day he had first seen her on his doorstep. "You gave me back my life," he said seriously. "You taught me that it was possible to love without fear, to hope without being crushed. You gave me our children, our home, our future. Everything good in my world exists because you knocked on my door and I let you in." Beatrice turned to kiss him, soft and sweet. "We gave each other everything," she corrected. "That is what love is, Wade. Two people choosing each other every day, building something together." "Then I choose you," Wade said, "today and every day after." "And I choose you," Beatrice replied. They sat together as the stars began to emerge, the same stars that had watched over them that first desperate winter, the same mountains that had witnessed the beginning of their love. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, safe and loved. Below them, their land stretched out fertile and full of promise. It was not the life that either of them had expected. Beatrice had run from an arranged marriage, and Wade had been hiding from his past. But somehow, in the frozen isolation of a Montana winter, they had found each other. And in finding each other, they had found themselves. The years continued to pass, each one adding to their story. William grew into a strong young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, and Wade began teaching him everything he knew about the land and the cattle. Catherine proved to have a gift with horses, able to gentle even the wildest Mustang with patience and kindness. Lily, the quietest of the three, loved books as much as her mother, and could often be found reading in unlikely places, perched in a tree or sitting in the hayloft. In 1889, Beatrice gave birth to their fourth child, a daughter they named Rose. She was a surprise, arriving when Beatrice was nearly 40, but she completed their family in a way that felt perfect and right. Wade, holding his youngest daughter in his arms and watching his wife sleep peacefully after the birth, felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to his eyes. The ranch became known throughout the valley as one of the best-run operations in the territory. Wade's reputation for honest dealing and quality stock spread, and buyers came from as far as Helena to purchase his cattle. Beatrice managed the books and the household with equal skill, and local women often sought her advice on everything from preserving vegetables to educating children. They added more land over the years, purchasing adjoining properties as they became available. They built a proper ranch house to replace their expanded cabin, with a wide porch and upstairs bedrooms for the children. They planted trees and gardens, built corrals and outbuildings, created something that would last beyond their lifetimes. But it was never about the accumulation of wealth or property, not really. It was about creating a place where their children could grow up safe and loved, where family and community mattered more than profit, where the values of hard work and integrity were lived every day. Wade never forgot what it felt like to be isolated and alone, nursing his wounds in that cabin on the mountain. And because he remembered, he made sure that their home was always open to those who needed help. They took in a young cowboy who had been injured in a stampede and had nowhere to go, employing him on the ranch and treating him like family. They helped a widow and her children when her husband died suddenly, providing them with supplies and support until she could get back on her feet. They opened their doors and their hearts, and the community around them flourished because of it. Beatrice, too, never forgot the desperation that had driven her into the winter storm, the feeling of having no choices and no hope. She became an advocate for young women in the valley, offering advice and sometimes sanctuary to those facing situations similar to what she had escaped. She taught reading and numbers to children whose families could not afford school. She spoke quietly but firmly about the rights of women to choose their own paths, and though some in the community thought her too forward, many more respected and admired her. As Montana moved toward statehood in 1889, Wade and Beatrice watched the changes with interest and sometimes concern. The wild, open territory of their early years was slowly being tamed, with more settlers arriving every year, more towns springing up, more laws and regulations. But they adapted as they always had, finding ways to thrive even as the world around them transformed. One autumn evening in 1892, the family gathered around the dinner table in their ranch house. William was 17 now, tall and broad-shouldered, already taking on many of the responsibilities of running the ranch. Catherine and Lily were 11, still young but showing signs of the strong women they would become. Rose was 3, a bright-eyed toddler who chattered constantly and made everyone laugh. "Tell us again about how you met," Catherine said, as she often did. She loved the story of her parents' unlikely romance. Wade and Beatrice exchanged a glance, and Wade smiled. "Well," he began, "it was the worst winter I had ever seen, and I had been alone in that cabin for months. I was starting to think I might go crazy from the isolation. And then one day, there was a knock at the door. And Mama was there," Lily continued, knowing the story by heart but never tiring of hearing it. "I was half frozen and desperate," Beatrice added. "I thought I was going to die out there in the snow. But your father opened that door and he let me in, no questions asked. He saved my life." "You saved mine," Wade said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "In every way that matters." William, who had heard the story countless times, still looked at his parents with something like awe. "Were you scared, Pa, when you opened the door and saw a stranger?" "Terrified," Wade admitted. "But not of her. I was scared of what it meant, having someone else there. I had been alone for so long, had convinced myself that was how it had to be. Opening that door meant opening myself up to possibility again, and that was frightening." "But you did it anyway," Catherine said. "I did it anyway," Wade confirmed, "and it was the best decision I ever made." After dinner, after the children had been sent to bed, Wade and Beatrice stood together on the porch of their ranch house as they did most evenings. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the stars were brilliant overhead. "Do you ever regret it?" Wade asked, pulling Beatrice close. "Choosing this life. You could have made it to Helena, found your aunt. You might have had an easier path." Beatrice turned to look at him, her brown eyes serious. "I have never regretted it for a single moment. This life we have built together, our children, our home, everything we have created, it is more than I ever dreamed possible. You are more than I ever dreamed possible." "I love you," Wade said, the words as true and necessary as they had been that first night in the cabin. "More now than ever." "And I love you," Beatrice replied. "Always." They stood together in the Montana night, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a legacy from nothing but love and determination. Behind them, their children slept safely. Around them, their land stretched out rich and productive. Above them, the stars shone, the same stars that had guided Beatrice to Wade's door all those years ago. The future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. There would be challenges ahead, they both knew. There always were. But they would face them together, as they had faced everything since that desperate winter day when a knock on the door had changed both their lives forever. And when they were old, when their children had children of their own, when the ranch had passed to the next generation, they would still have each other. They would still have the memory of that first moment, that leap of faith, that choice to open the door and let love in. It was a good life, a full life, a life worth living. And it had all started with 3 simple actions. She knocked, he opened, and they both said yes to the possibility of something more. Years later, when Wade and Beatrice were in their 60s, sitting on that same porch and watching their grandchildren play in the yard, someone would ask them the secret to a long and happy marriage. They would look at each other and smile, that private smile that still passed between them after all these years. "Open the door," Wade would say. "Let love in," Beatrice would add. And never, ever let it go. It was that simple. It was that profound. And it was the truest thing either of them would ever say.